to welcome people to the panel, Storytelling in the Age of Disinformation. My name is Andrea Valdez. I'm the editor-in-chief of The 19th, a new news organization that covers the intersection of gender, politics, and policy. And I'm joined by panelists Tom Rosenstiel and Nora Benitez. And if each of you could just give a little introduction to who you are and what it is you do, and then we can get going.
Sure, well, we can go in the order that you named us. I'm Tom Rosenstiel. I'm the director of the American Press Institute, which is a nonprofit in Washington that works on helping news organizations be sustainable. I was one of the co-founders of the Pew Research Center and directed the media research there for 16 years. I've written a number of books about journalism, including one called The Elements of Journalism that some of you may have had to suffer through reading. I was the press critic at the LA Times for about 10 years, a long time ago. Covered a lot of presidential campaigns and wrote about the intersection of media and politics. And in my early in the mornings before I get to go to the day job, I write political thrillers for HarperCollins.
Sure. Well, thanks so much for having us. I'm Nora Benitez, and I'm the director of U.S. Free Expression Programs at PEN America. I have been a lawyer now for many years, and previously was a civil rights litigator in the Deep South. I focused on First Amendment and other constitutional issues. And when I came to PEN America, it was to try to build out our US programs and monitor and spotlight what we see as emerging threats to free expression. And so now I guide our national advocacy agenda from the legal work, our policy work, and our mobilization of people around the country defending free expression issues and defending the First Amendment. That takes a number of forms now. We work on defending press freedom, protest rights, and I also manage our media literacy and our disinformation defense program, which really is an effort that has arisen out of our concerns around how words are used and manipulated. And so we work with communities around the country, newsrooms, we work with Tom and API, trying to equip people, voters and other online users to combat the spread of disinformation. And so I think, the idea that democracy might be under threat is one that feels abstract when you talk about it for people. And so part of what I think our role is at PEN America is really being able to parse through for people what those abstract concepts mean in real time and with real examples that show people how it affects all of our lives. So it's great to be here. Thanks so much.
Yes, thank you both for doing this. So the Mayborn Conference, the theme this year is about truth and bringing truth into focus. We're here to talk about disinformation, but I thought I would do a little bit of table setting because we've been talking about disinformation, I think, a lot in the press, and people are becoming used to the word. It, I think, is actually kind of a new-ish word to the lexicon, but it certainly is not a new concept. And so I thought that maybe one of you could talk a little bit about what is disinformation? How is that different from misinformation, which is another word that comes up? How is that different from propaganda or outright lies? I think that these things might be conflated in some people's minds. So maybe just defining some of these terms might be helpful to start our conversation.
Nora, you want to take that? That's kind of right in your sweet spot, I think.
Yeah, sure. So, we host trainings all the time. Now they're virtual. So part of what we try to do is give people information about these terms. Even when we started researching at PEN America, the kind of phenomenon of what was happening in the digital age and how misleading information was affecting people, we originally used terms like fraudulent news and fake news. And so it's interesting to see how terms have evolved, how the way that we think of these concepts has really evolved. Disinformation is kind of the gold standard term that I think experts use a lot to refer to information that is created or distributed with the intent to deceive people. And misinformation is really just mistaken information, the kind that is shared. Perhaps it was disinformation that someone created with the intent to deceive, and then I share it, not realizing it's fraudulent in some way or manipulated. And so there are these ways that part of what we try to explain to people is something could start as disinformation and then really become misinformation. And the way that content might reach either of you, let's say if we're friends on Facebook, could be through me sharing something and it's misinformation, but it could have originated really with that harder intent to deceive people. The other sort of element here, though, is that I actually don't think a lot of what we see is hard stop disinformation a lot of the time now. I think what we see aren't just outright lies, as you say, Andrea, but it is the kind of misleading narrative, things that cast doubt on institutions, our beliefs, kind of the shared ideas that we all have. And I think that that's a much more insidious threat to society than simply hard stop fake news, let's say, the headlines that are crafted by bad actors. The stuff that instead is shared by trusted people that we know and we don't know how to then correct or verify information, that can just seep into our lexicon and kind of our own sense of what we believe in. And I actually think that that's the stuff that that's really the hardest nut to crack.
I'd like to just add a couple of things there. One is that I think what we're seeing today in this environment, I mean, a lot of these classical terms about disinformation came up, and propaganda came up in a time of more oligarchical media, where people were getting one narrative, and disinformation was designed to be an alternative narrative that people would believe. Right now, I think we're in an environment of such fragmentation that what we think of as fake news or may actually have the intention of simply causing doubt. In other words, the point of news of false narratives is not to make us necessarily believe the false narratives, but to just doubt all information sources. And then and that leads us to put our trust in a leader who we like. You know, he seems, or she seems to kind of speak to me in a style that I understand. So fake news that creates a sense of nihilism or doubt is a rich soil for political leaders to take advantage of. One other point, just worth making to add on to what Nora said, in a famous essay written in the 1970s about public lying, philosopher Hannah Arendt said that the most effective lies about public life are ones that contain grains of truth and change the context or the meaning of something. An example might be the idea that on her deathbed, Justice Ginsburg said she thought that the government should wait until after the election to pick the next justice. And then a meme went out there, or a narrative went out there, that was a hoax that had been invented by liberals, and it was untrue. Okay, there's a germ of something that happened there that's true, and what about that am I supposed to believe, as opposed to just making up a fantasist myth out of whole cloth.
Yeah, there's so much in here. I almost know where to start. Let's start with some of the hoaxes and where this information kind of gets out. I think that a lot of this disinformation having a meme-like quality originates and gets really passed around on social media. And I'm curious to know, what do you all think of the role of social media in creating these different narratives, false narratives, disinformation campaigns? And what is the responsibility of journalists to, and not only responsibility, it feels like it's so overwhelming. There's just so much of it, and it's insidious, it's in hidden places, it's in Facebook feeds or Facebook groups that might be private or you don't have access to. How do journalists combat this? How do they provide a source of truth in a place where there's so much information and such a flood of information that it might be difficult for a reader to pick out the signal from the noise?
Tom, I'm going to defer to you on starting with journalists, and then I can follow up on our community
Okay,
work.
that's fair. I'll make a mess of it and you clean it up.
Okay.
So there's a lot there, right? I mean, journalism is in the business of verification. I mean, serious journalism, reality-based, which means assessing different versions, going to enough sources, and then trying to provide what some people call the plumb line. Okay, what here can I believe? In the old days, the metaphor for journalism was that it was a gatekeeper, and it would tell people what to know versus, a gatekeeper that would let people know what they, to let people know facts. That metaphor imagines that there's a gate, that there's a fence around people's lives, and journalists are standing at the gate. And, if a rumor comes along, they won't let it through. And that used to be, by the way, one of the norms of journalism. If something was a rumor, that you wouldn't pass it along, because why would you give people information that was false? Today, rather than being a gatekeeper over what the public knows, the press very often is an annotator of what they have already heard. In other words, what you find in your social media stream may not have ever originated in a news organization, It may not be news. It could be a rumor. It could be something from, that was originated in a chat room, originated in a false news site. So a good portion of what the press is doing today is trying to knock down things that are false. And the question of how you do that is very complicated. I'm sure we'll get into this a little bit more. How do you knock something down that's false without amplifying it? And so one term we'll probably talk a little bit more about is the notion of strategic amplification. When do you decide to do it? When do you decide something doesn't merit it, it's not big enough? And how do you do it? Another dimension of this is repetition. I mean, we know from all kinds of social science research that you can make people believe things that are not true by repeating them enough. There's a study from the University of Indiana that showed, it was an experiment that showed you could make people believe that Scottish men wore saris, not kilts. Because if you repeated it enough, people would say, you know what, maybe I was wrong. Maybe it wasn't kilts. Maybe I was wrong about that. So that's not confirmation bias, right? This is not a political ideological issue, what Scottish men wear. And the press, norms of the press tend to not work around a constant repetition of information. The press tends to report a story and then say, well, we did that. And particularly in the era of print, it's a little easier to repeat things and resurface things for folks. But the norms of journalism were really built around how do we spotlight things. Walter Lippmann's metaphor is a searchlight. How do we spotlight things that people need to know? And how do we present them in a way that's somewhat coherent? But most of these journalistic norms were developed long before the internet and long before there was any consciousness of how does the brain work to process information and what are the ways that we're supposed to present it so that people will believe it. Propagandists, people engaged in trying to undermine the solidity of a country and increase polarization, don't spend any time verifying stuff because they're not in that business. But they spend a lot of time thinking about this notion of how people process information. So journalists are at a pretty significant disadvantage because it's really not, they're trying to learn on the fly a whole new business about the ways that the brain processes and believes things.
So I'm trying to now make sense of Tom's, pivoting and building on that. Whenever I speak at conferences in real life, right? So like 30 years ago, it feels like now, when we were doing that, I would, and on topics around news, information integrity, disinformation, I often try to ask people in the audience, how often do you click on the actual article your friends share on Facebook? Versus, if you're really honest, right? How often do you just read that headline and then act like you've consumed news? And this is so informal. This is anecdotal. I am not a longitudinal, researcher in any way, but almost everyone will eventually, when I ask that, raise their hand and say kind of the like, yeah, I will often not read. And I kind of think that treating social media as a news source is something we have to help undo in the public. That, if Tom and I are friends on Facebook and he shares something, that's great. But I can't just consume what he has shared in his single comment, his, quick take or whatever, as the thing, the actual news piece. And so when I think about who's going to be attending something like this conference, I imagine very educated, thoughtful people who will maybe read articles all the way through. Unfortunately, though, even the people that attend a lot of our trainings, I think people aren't reading articles all the way through. They're not then digesting information. They're not thinking critically about, frankly, what are the hallmarks of journalism? And so when you see memes, when you see information conveyed in pithy, fun, funny ways, of course it's entertaining. But entertainment is really different than information and like educative content that we should be digesting around civic engagement and our politics and other issues that affect our lives. All of that is to say that I think there are legitimate reasons, though, to be skeptical of news. That often various communities around the country have been left out of critical reporting. That is not a reason to distrust the entire industry. It is an element that we must reckon with when we work with reporters and when we work with communities. And so part of what we've been doing is trying to hold listening sessions at Penn, inspired by a lot of our own findings, that when there isn't reporting in certain places, whether you want to call it a news desert, you want to call it just a lack of funding, there are a number of ways this can happen. Public trust in institutions goes down, voter engagement goes down, salaries of government employees goes up. And so part of what I think we have to do is grapple with how do we actually bring reporters and voters and members of the public together? Because when we are doing that, we have found that members of the public will say, I actually didn't realize what goes into writing a headline. I actually didn't even realize what investigative reporting means, that sources are a concept that reporters really think about. And I'm kind of distilling these into the most accessible terms, but the idea that reporters can convey that to the public and the public will then respond and find it compelling is really exciting. And so I think that it can be one of the solutions, if we're thinking sort of in a big picture way, how we push back against false narratives. I think one of them is actually giving reporters the opportunity to talk about what they do. And that reporting now is not mean. And it is not me reading Tom's comment on Facebook. Reporting is the stuff that will take time for the public. And so one of our lines is we always say truth takes time. Part of that means that it's on the public, which, do you really want to do your homework? I don't know. Do you have time to? Of course, I'm going to read Tom's hot take on Facebook and then just call it a day because I'm busy. And the truth is I'm really busy. But I think we're at a point now where if we ask more of people and explain really with them what the urgency is, we are at least finding exciting ways and feedback from communities that they're really interested in learning about the role of the media.
Yeah, so the media needs more spotlight movies or the Post movies or just maybe some, Hollywoodification of what it is that we do, though it's really kind of boring when you get down to it, because a lot of times we're sitting at our desks and making phone calls and it's not the most glamorous thing. It's not a Law and Order episode. But I want to go to this notion of the truth takes time. I think that is exactly right. And I think that it is at odds with some of the business imperatives around journalism right now, which is having a business crisis and a financial crisis to a degree. I think that there is, and I have heard this, from reporters that I know, and I'm sure that Tom, you have too, that you're trying to balance as a reporter, or as a newsroom, the need and urgency to get a story up and get it out and get it, published and capture the clicks, which is, I know sounds craven, but is part of the business model for a lot of organizations, so that you can get the advertising revenue and so on and so forth. And you're doing that and moving quickly, and you want to get the information out, if you're being earnest about it, get the information out as soon as possible and get the accurate information out as soon as possible. But to your point, Nora, truth takes time, right? And it takes resources, and those things can be at odds, like, again, with the business model. So, I know that I'm not going to ask anyone here to try and solve the business model of journalism. But I do think that, what is it that journalists can be doing to slow down if they can, or be more mindful in the moment to make the right decisions around what it is that they're publishing, especially when some of the things that you're reporting on, there might be bad faith actors in positions of power who are trying to spin you, which is not new, but how do you not create false equivalencies, both sidesism, or the other things that I think have gotten more recognized by the public, and they see that in reporting, and B, that it has come up as a pretty frequent criticism of journalism. So there's a lot there, but if either of y'all want to talk about it.
I can take a first whack at this, because this is something that I've thought a lot about and written some about. And there's some actual good news here. So I think it's useful for people, whether they're journalists or news consumers, to think of, and I'm oversimplifying here, kind of two planes when it comes to news. One of those is news that you're going to want in real time, that is moving fairly quickly and is maybe the first take on something. And that news does relate to clicks and attention, and when are you posting, and is this publication a useful utility for me as it pertains to my curiosity, my demand, in an advertising driven world, that was particularly important. It wasn't even clear 15 years ago whether people would read long stories online. The research was ambiguous, partly because we just didn't have good tools. We didn't have good ways of monitoring. And people thought that maybe the internet was just shrinking our attention spans. So that's one part of what a news operation needs to do. It needs to do the jobs report tomorrow within 5 or 10 minutes of that report being released, provide a little context on it, get it up there when people are curious about it, maybe 5 minutes, and keep going. But the model, the economic model for journalism, is really shifting in a significant way, both locally and nationally, towards subscriptions. For people paying for the news, that we're probably going to be in a point where half or maybe 60, 2/3 of the revenue to a news organization is going to come from consumer revenue, from people paying for it. The newspaper world used to be 80% advertising and only 20% of the money comes from subscriptions. Once you're in a subscription world, and that's what's driving your revenue, a whole different kind of journalism is what the data show people really care about. And in that instance, it's the New York Times investigation into Trump's taxes. It's stories that you may only do once a month or once a week, but people notice them enough that they say, wow, that thing is pretty indispensable to my life. They really do a good job. They're valuable. I value them enough that I'm going to pay $10 a month or $100 a year or whatever that is. Okay, how does this relate to the speed of information and truth taking time? That longer work, that other plane, that slower plane of information, also lasts longer. It has a shelf life, and the context and the facts that are there are stubborn. They're hard to wash away. And so that's a nice moment where the economics of journalism and the kind of mission of truth-telling reinforce each other. When it comes to both sidism and some of the weaknesses of what we think of as the neutral journalistic model, time is also a factor there. The press has gotten pretty good at stories that we have a lot of knowledge on. You'd be hard pressed to go to a news site today, even a news site that was sort of a thoughtful conservative news site, even the Wall Street Journal, and have the classic both sidism about climate change, where people who are climate deniers are quoted equally with people, with scientists who, even when the president engages in climate denial, the Wall Street Journal this week said the science is overwhelming, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Because that's a story that's well established. Same thing if you see information about voter fraud today. In the Wall Street Journal this week, after the debate, the Wall Street Journal story said, for a very conservative audience, that there's no evidence that these claims about mail-in ballots are accurate. So that's a great case where that sort of both sidism, or the simple notions of balance that we might have thought about, we've gotten past that. YouTube is a great example. More people get news from YouTube than get it in text form anywhere. If you look across usage across the world. YouTube has a huge problem because their algorithms have a hard time identifying video. But on a question like climate change, if there's climate denier videos that show up, they are now linking to Wikipedia pages and saying that will tell you climate change is real. The problem is a lot harder for a journalist to contend with on a fast-breaking story that is new, where we do not have established knowledge, and we're trying to find out, we're trying to get into the story, and at that point, it's pretty easy for people to put out false information, and for journalists who have less expertise on something that's new to be quoting both sides, because we're still in the very beginning of a sorting out process. By the way, Google has even said that during breaking news events, they change their algorithm so that recency, or how new something is, no longer is elevated as high as it is on most of the time, because they're aware that false information, which is not verified or maybe made up, can be produced much more easily and more quickly than information that an organization like the New York Times, the Washington Post, or the Wall Street Journal has taken time to verify, because it actually takes time. Now there we're just talking about an hour or two, but that can make a significant difference in search algorithms. So yes, the truth takes time. And when we talk about truth in journalistic terms, there's really sort of this longer plane and this faster plane.
Nora, do you have anything to add there?
I love that. I mean, I thought that was frankly very useful. You know, I'm not a reporter. I come at this as, from my legal background and thinking about solutions, and how even the best one-off examples of what certain newsrooms are doing, that will not change an entire industry. And so part of what I think we need to do is spotlight what really promising practices are. And Tom has not paid me to say this. He has no idea I'm about to say this. I actually think that some of the amazing guides and toolkits that API is putting out about how to meet voters and meet the public where they are in coverage are some of, frankly, the best work I have seen in this space in helping to kind of empower and reset how reporters are thinking about their writing and the role of what their coverage really means for communities. So Tom has no idea I was going to say that. Actually, I really mean it. But
I will pass that along to the people who do that.
Oh yeah,
not me.
They know it too, because I send them my fan mail. But I think that the larger point here is, frankly, from perspectives of industries that can signal boost and amplify, or undergird what reporters are trying to do, and just beginning to shift how we think of their role and the impact of their role, I think it's important for us to have those. So organizers, faith leaders, educators, there are groups that are kind of grass tops for communities. And I think that it's incumbent upon them as well to share with the media how the media's role in its shifting identity is actually making a difference. There is kind of this opening I noticed when COVID happened and when we all began here in the US to work from home, that when people were hungry for information and there was a need for credible storytelling about truly just where do I go get groceries, the kind of daily, almost mundane things we wouldn't even think about before, what did people do? They said, oh, reporters are heroes. And it created a political moment, I think, as well, that we've been trying to capitalize on, frankly, and push legislators to see the value of local news, the value of reporting, and that the industry as it has been built on certain financial structures and models is not viable. We know it's not going to be viable. And how do we take that moment and the kind of excitement and interest people have to push for political mobilization as well? So we're working with members of Congress. I think they're going to be a really critical sector here in helping to be a bigger signal boost voice in all of this. And so I don't have much on the expert side because I'm not a reporter, I'm not an editor, but I think that it's important in the ways that other sectors can be involved that we do, and that we try to really bring home that what is happening is really powerful. The change from advertising money to subscription money, and seeing how communities are then really speaking out, talking about what they want, that's really exciting. And at least from our free expression world, I'm happy to see that these other sectors are trying to take part in some kind of shift.
I have one other I have several journalism questions, but then I do want to get back to some of what you were talking about, Nora, about, some of the free speech you had referenced, or the free speech issues you had referenced earlier in the conversation. But I wanted to stop and pause on, you had mentioned, COVID-19, and when that was a new evolving story. And Tom, you talked about the need to, be present as a news organization when a story is brand new, but that is when things get a little more complicated because we don't have the established knowledge, as you said. And with the coronavirus, that was obviously a gigantic story, and it was a science story for many reasons, right? Because it's a health crisis. Also, a story about society and how it is that we're grappling with this. But one of the things that struck me when that was kind of unfolding in the first couple of months is that there was, I think, a crisis of confidence in the resources that we as journalists would typically go to get verified information. To your point, Tom, verification is what journalists do. And so when you have something like the CDC, which, people are questioning whether or not the CDC is giving the best information or accurate information, or the CDC feels like it needs to slow down to try and get the best and most accurate information to give to people. How do journalists deal with that when the resources that you've always seen as the factual resources, the verification methods, that they come under question?
So I think there's this is where when things are complicated is when you go back to basics, right? That's when you go back to fundamentals. If you're a musician and your playing is starting to get sloppy, you go back to scales or rudiments. If you're an athlete, if you're starting to underperform, you do the same thing. You go back and you break down your swing or your step or whatever it is. So in uncertain environments, in environments where you think you're being lied to or information is chaotic, you kind of slow your brain down and say, all right, how do you know this? Are you a first? Are you in the exact source, or is this secondhand? Things like that. You start to think about the epistemology of the information. And a second concept, besides going back to fundamentals, is, and this is a newer idea that we didn't always have in journalism, I think, is humility and acknowledging what you don't know. I think audiences actually appreciate it when you say, this is unknown or the evidence is not clear. It's better to say that than experts disagree, because the experts may actually, if something is new, the experts don't actually disagree. There just isn't settled knowledge. And to do things that make it look like experts don't know what they're talking about, or everything is theoretical, or science is just a series of guesses and there's no advance in knowledge, that you're undermining your own purpose. And in the same way, adopting a false omniscience, as if you know everything, as if you sent out a reporter who knew nothing, and 40 minutes later they're supposed to post a story that's really authoritative. It's BS, and people know it's BS. So a little humility and acknowledging what you don't know, and acknowledging that the truth is provisional. Just to add one other little bit to this, and that is that the trust research, as I've broken it down, I've spent way more years on it than most of the people who are listening to this have ever been alive. But in the end, distrust or lack of trust is about motivation. It's my assessment of what is your intention? It's not a checking of the box, like, did you name your sources? Did you spell everything right? And it's my assessment, it's my summative assessment of do I think your intentions are good? Or are you trying to pull one off on me because you're really a sniveling liberal feminist, and this 19th is this, is secretly part of the Democratic Party weaponry. So things that tell me about you and your intentions and how you did things and what you don't know and what you're still working on and what's provisional and what you have doubts about, that is all helpful in the end towards building some sense that, oh, okay, these guys they seem okay.
Yeah, and you know what? I think that's a really good leadership tactic, and one that I feel like I've tried to adopt in my own life, which is, when you don't know something, say you don't know. And people, they either are happy to see someone admit, ignorance and want to learn something. And if they can teach you that, then they're all the happier, because then they can help you. What you're saying here too about just copying to when you don't know something, is a little bit of what Nora was talking about, pulling the curtain back, showing the public what journalists do, how the reporting process works. It's demystifying the act of journalism, right? Which I think is interesting and right and good. One of the other things is, I feel like journalists want to have this, to be authoritarian, not authoritarian. Whoa, that was horrible. Gaffe. To be authoritative, because you want to have trust in the industry, you want to have trust in the institution, you want to, make sure people believe what you're writing or what your organization is writing. So yeah, I'm not able to finish that thought. In any case, what I really wanted to come back around to for Nora was to talk about if there's any homework that journalists can take with them, in addition to pulling back the curtain and showing the reporting process. What are some of the other things that journalists can and should be doing in this moment, when disinformation is so prevalent, when we're seeing it come from some of the highest parts of the government and corporations? Is there something that journalists can and should be doing? Or another part of the question, if it's not what advice do you have, what stories do you think are being underreported or not talked about with regards to, what different disinformation campaigns might be out there? A big one that I think is getting a lot of reporting, of course, is voting rights and the ability to vote right now. But are there other things that reporters should be paying attention to right now? I'm just hoping to give a little bit of homework and let journalists have a sense of what it is they could or should be doing right now in this moment.
Let's give them all the homework, because they're not busy in the lead up to the election. Well, so I think the question of oxygen is a fantastic one. What are reporters giving oxygen to, and what are they not? Sometimes when we hold convenings with reporters and editors and we bring in voters, it's really great to hear that editors, for example, are weighing, here's a fun clickbaity type story that we decided not to run. And instead, we're going to try to really pause and, cover an interesting story that we know less about, but that it's one that communities will want to hear and that we have heard interest in. So I think that is a great question. In the lead up to the election, though, my biggest concern, and I think Tom would agree, is the kind of chaos, the fever pitch of people not knowing where to turn for news, not even really knowing how to sift through disinformation. Because in order to vote, you have to not only confirm something is false or misleading. Let's say you see a video that your friend has shared, and it's a polling location that they say has closed. Well, to vote, if you think your polling location has closed, you have to confirm that it has closed. Then you have to confirm, where is your new location? Is there one? There are so many questions that, especially for voters that may typically not vote, we know that people are more interested this year, this election cycle, than ever before. The Knight Foundation just released a report on this, that now a majority of even the emerging electorate says they are absolutely certain they're going to vote. So we need to be giving people information in our reporting, and this is what I would ask of reporters, that the credible links and pieces of voter engagement information, if you're at the local level, let's say that's links to your local county officials. If you're reporting at the state or national level, that is linking to the National Association of Secretaries of State. I'm happy to provide information. I'm sure Tom is. It's the kind of thing where if someone's reading an article that is about the election or the electoral process or any aspect thereof, giving people easy access to nonpartisan and credible information about how they can vote can make the difference between people somehow thinking it might not be worth it if they read about issues in their hometown, issues in their region, or if they're given the opportunity to click on something really concrete. I actually think that can make the difference then in people not falling prey to disinformation. So that's one thing, is really just embedding credible links and cutting the kind of time down for people on the voting side to have to do their homework. The other thing I would say is, and there are some great reporters that do this, is the kinds of things to help minimize manipulation of their own reporting. Ways that reporters can put watermarks or X's over images and videos if they are sharing them in their reporting. Ways that they can try to cite to and make sure that they can confirm the veracity of social media accounts. We saw in 2016 examples where reporters with no ill intent shared and cited to fake Twitter accounts. That's the kind of thing that then I think can do harm when people say, well, we can't trust reporters. They're going to cite to whatever and not do their homework. So making sure that there are practices embedded in your storytelling that actually minimize the opportunity for bad actors to take and twist what you're reporting on. And then I'll give one final thing, and that is reporting itself is a big aspect of this, but there is sort of what I think of as the extracurricular elements of being a reporter, being a responsible vector of information, that you could potentially be the difference between people on your social media feeds. Andrea, you have an amazing following. Like, you have the opportunity, and I think can be an influencer in ways that draw people to credible sources. Whether that is voter registration issues, interesting stories around how the tabulation process happens. Those are the things that, not just in your reporting, but in your lives, I would really ask that reporters think about what their role is. Because I think that you can be a kind of stopgap, and one of the best stopgaps to preventing the spread of disinformation.
Andrea, if I just want to accent something that Nora said, because it's really, it's easy to gloss over this. And that is that in previous years, we would have thought that this kind of how to vote and where to vote and that kind of stuff was such a minor thing. Our political coverage would have been focused on, the hard-bitten political reporters following candidates around and covering the daily joust between the candidates. I hear it from editors. We all know it. The president and his rhetoric has elevated it. But what voters want to know is really basic stuff. Who's running? How do I vote? How do I mail it in, et cetera. And the folks who are doing that work, that voter administration work, they are not necessarily political experts. They're not running around with candidates. So this whole arena, which would have been a handful of stories in another year, has become a central focus of how journalists can really help voters. It's a very voter-centric approach to covering the campaign. And if you just think back for a second to 2016, imagine if there was a WikiLeaks dump of personal emails from somebody in the Biden campaign, and there were stories written about, how these sort of meaningless, mundane emails. I mean, some of my emails were caught in that WikiLeaks. I mean, reporters were a lot more credulous in the way they covered, the details of some of that than they would be today. 4 years of misinformation, disinformation, and rhetoric about fake news has really changed. I mean, it hasn't changed journalism fundamentally, but it has changed. It's made us better. I mean, Trump, in a lot of ways, has made journalists better, more skeptical, and more epistemological, to use a fancy word.
Well, I will use what limited influence I have, Nora, to say that we should normalize the fact that we might not know the election results on November 3rd, and that is okay. We might know a week later, a month later, and that is perfectly fine. That is the way the process works.
Yes. Yes, just underscoring, delays will not mean corruption or a rigged election.
Yes.
They may, in some places, be worth attending to, but yes, we need to be patient. Thank you.
Yes. I am going to ask one more question because I am going to try and get one off here. I really want to end on hopefully what I just said was optimistic too, but I want to end on an optimistic note. And I wanted to ask if there's just one thing that each of you is optimistic about, even in an era where it feels like there's an onslaught of disinformation or an onslaught of things to do, and it feels overwhelming. I think that there is some positivity out there, and I would love to hear you just one thing that you have a positive outlook on with regards to this topic.
I would say that that the fact that people think this election matters is important. I think we understand the vulnerability. I mean, I think as worried as everyone is, our heightened awareness of the vulnerabilities of American democracy and our being afraid of its vulnerabilities and worried about them is a healthy thing. Taking something for granted is what I think got us to this difficult spot. And yes, it's dispiriting, it's worrying, but we're on it, I think.
Well, I'm going to start. It's only one short thing, but I'm going to begin by saying the thing that worried me and why I actually came to PEN America was to try to help talk about why breakdowns in our civic discourse are happening and why we are reaching these polarizing ends of conversation with each other. And so the thing I'm hopeful about is the ways that I see people's minds slowly shifting. That is in every sector, actually, legislative and government, media, my legal sector. I think that there is a very potent, I would say there's a flashpoint that's going to happen around disinformation and the idea that people might bring more sensitivity and thoughtfulness to how we're thinking about these issues, to broker conversation, to be critical and thoughtful and not just skeptical, but thoughtful about this is what makes me excited. In our work on media literacy, I see people finally beginning to come to us saying, I've now begun thinking a little bit about what you said with this or this. And these are only 15,000 people, but that is really how I think movements can begin. And the idea that what we're doing is slowly shifting our digital intelligence for the digital age I know this discussion is about the information and disinformation age, but I think there's something bigger, that the digital age has changed how we are communicating. And so I am very hopeful, actually, that the coalitions, from experts to grassroots to organizers, are kind of mobilizing in a way around this election season to information share. And the sharing aspect is, I think, a bit different than what I have seen in the past. That people are kind of at a point where the egos are aside and we're like, let's get this work done. Let's flood the zone with as much credible information as we can and do it in the furtherance of our being together to push our democracy to how it should be functional and healthy.
Well, that's a great way to end. Thank you both so much for agreeing to do this. I had a wonderful conversation with you both, and thank you to the Mayborn for hosting this. Really appreciate all of y'all.